Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Speaking of victim blaming, I actually would quite like your help with something this morning. There is a naive optimism on the liberal side of social politics, or if you want to be a little bit more inflammatory, on the liberal side of the culture wars. And by liberal, we simply mean a sort of do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, or live and let live. Or for me, in its purest form, it simply means that you will be assessed or judged, or your value will be determined by your actions, not by your ethnicity or your gender or your sexuality or your financial status or your title or your inherited privilege or the robes that you wear, or whatever it may be. We are far from creating that New Jerusalem at the moment, but that is, for me, what a liberal is. It means I will judge you by the contents of your heart and your history. I will not judge you by the colour of your skin or the gender of people that you fall in love with. It's weird, I know. That occasionally needs to be pointed out. Lots of people who think liberal is a dirty word presumably subscribe to the opposite school of thought. They want to be judged by the colour of their skin because under a sort of loose lens of white supremacism, it's the only way in which they will ever be able to feel superior to anybody else. So, here is the problem. Here is the naive optimism. The Daily Mirror today, or the Guardian today, publish old articles by the new Prime Minister, the newish Prime Minister Boris Johnson, which are, to most right-thinking people, repellent. Yes. But at this point, of course, the usual suspects start queuing up with their columns and their comments to actually be repelled by the people who are repelled. It's why you see old white men pretending not to understand what racism is, or pretending not to understand what Islamophobia is. You know, I mean, most of them all work for the same magazine, but you know that we are addressing here a fairly straightforward intervention from the former Prime Minister that his enemies and critics have put into the public sphere in the hope of damaging him. Here's the bad news. It won't damage him. This is, I think, and I've never met the man, thankfully, so I have absolutely no idea what he says to people when he meets with them. People that he has met with in this country's political sphere include, of course, Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, but all Steve Bannon's peculiar political genius seems to involve is telling people who've managed to keep their prejudices and bigotries under a curtain for 10 or 20 years to remove the curtain and go for full-throated prejudice and bigotry, because, seriously, after 30 years of, quotes, political correctness gone mad, end quotes, you will be amazed how many people will roll out the red carpet for you if you give them a green light for the ancient hatreds that they've been forced to nurse in secret due to the privations of political correctness. So it won't work when I tell you that Boris Johnson stands accused yet again of racial stereotyping. He's also, it has emerged from some old, borderline ancient journalism, a 20-year-old piece in which he writes in incredibly unpleasant terms about illegitimate children. I don't know for sure whether he had one of his own at the time, but he does now. So the level of hypocrisy involved in this kind of commentary is actually weapons grade. But I'll say it again, and it pains me to say this. I say it with no pleasure. In fact, that's become my trademark, really, being right and regretful. Nobody will care. This will change nobody's opinion about Boris Johnson. He wrote disgusting journalism about single mothers, and then he impregnated one. Doesn't matter, does it? You haven't changed your view of him at all. Not even one iota, hasn't shifted a scintilla. So we're not going to do a what do you think of him story. We're going to do a what do you think he means story, okay? And the phrase I would like to draw your attention to this morning is a relatively straightforward one. It is this phrase: all the young people I know, i.e. those under 30, are just as avaricious as we flinty Thatcherite yuppies of the 1980s. In fact, they have an almost Nigerian interest in money and gadgets of all kinds. Now, the newspaper that's published this today lines up the co-convener of Stand Up to Racism to condemn these words as deeply racist and offensive. He reminds us, of course, that it can be added to the pickaninnies and watermelon smiles, and the abject refusal to properly apologise and change his behaviour around racism. But I don't know. I'm not black. I'm not Nigerian. Bizarrely, I have connections with Nigeria. And for a man of peculiarly milky whiteness, you'll probably be slightly surprised to learn that I have Nigerian cousins. I think it's part of the reason why, until I was surprisingly old, I didn't really know what racism was. The idea that you could look at somebody, clock their skin colour, and then change your view of them accordingly was actually laughable to me. Same with anti-Semitism, as I mentioned to you earlier in the week. I didn't grow up in a particularly multicultural world, certainly in the context of religion. I never went to a school that wasn't Catholic. I went to schools that were run by nuns and schools that were run by monks and schools that were attached to churches. And I never really even had any Jewish friends until I left school. And then I had loads, actually, and still do. And anti-Semitism was something I just found baffling, and I was sceptical about it. Same with racism. I know. My dad would cover National Front marches when I was a kid, and he was a Telegraph's correspondent in the Midlands. My dad would cover National Front marches, but he didn't bring it home. It was, it must have been explained to me. But when you've got mixed race cousins, when your cousins are half Nigerian, the idea that you should look down on them or that you're somehow inherently better than them is so pants down bonkers that thankfully my schoolboy sensibilities never even acknowledged it. Some people, of course, grow up enslaved to the notion that their skin colour or someone else's skin colour is an indication of their moral or personal worth. Lots of people still feel that way. You don't have to reach far into the cesspits of British journalism to find people who will routinely contend that you can't be British unless you're white. But I don't know what Boris Johnson means. I genuinely don't know what he means. I will add a side order here of inquiry, and that will be unlikely to prove particularly fertile ground. Once we have established what we together thinks he means by young people have an almost Nigerian interest in money, the phone number you need, by the way, is 0345 6060 973. We will perhaps, if it turns out that the accusations of racism are accurate here, and I don't know, we will perhaps examine my pessimistic theory that this will change precisely nobody's mind, which means potentially that we're edging towards a place where voters don't mind about having racist politicians. We've probably already been in that place, but as I've mentioned a few times, because of what we came to call political correctness, they wouldn't shout it from the rooftops, would they? They'd just sort of confine it to Twitter accounts with dog avatars or the comment section of the Daily Mail website. But I could be wrong. Maybe we're doing Boris Johnson a grave disservice. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And the question is this: what do you think he meant? What do you think Boris Johnson meant when he said that British young people have an almost Nigerian interest in money? Explain it to me. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And, in the context of matters racial, I thought you might be interested to know. I've been following this blue story with a degree of interest, but as ever, right-wing media puts it through the lens of racism, do me a favour, and I do find that quite unpleasant. But this notion that there have been 25 incidents at View Cinemas, which prompted the original ban, just put in a little request this morning to the relevant press officers, asking how many of those 25 incidents have crime numbers. I'm sure the answer will be 25, but we just thought we'd double check. That's kind of the business that we're in. 13 minutes after 10. Let me double check your view on this. What did Boris Johnson mean when he said that young people have an almost Nigerian interest in money? And we may, if there's time, move on to the other comments about single mothers, which he blamed for producing a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children, adding that social housing was an enticement for them to become pregnant. Of course, the woman who is now a single mother with his illegitimate child was living with a wealthy partner at the time that Boris Johnson cuckolded him. So I guess that, in his defence, means that social housing never would have been an option in his particular case. So we may also have a look at that. What's wrong with illegitimate children, we might ask, and how do you feel about the fact that the Prime Minister is or was possessed of such pungent views? It's coming up to 10:15. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The question is relatively straightforward. What did he mean when he said young people have an almost Nigerian interest in money? And if there's time, I'm right, aren't I? If you're a fan, this won't put you off him. You'll start undertaking various contortions to claim that it's an utterly uncontroversial observation. And if you're not a fan, this is just more grist to your mill. Everybody else, I guess I envy your ambivalence. British children have an almost Nigerian interest in money. What did Boris Johnson mean when he wrote those words? And if there's time, how do you feel about him blaming single mothers for producing a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children, and then going on to impregnate a single mother with an illegitimate child? 18 minutes after 10 is time. Valentine is in Bromley. Valentine, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
Yeah, so I feel quite qualified to comment on this question just because I'm a Nigerian and a Brit. So I kind of get the sense of what he's trying to say with that comment.
Yes.
So I think, firstly, to give some context, Nigerians have tended to be quite ambitious people, as just the spirit of Nigerians are very ambitious. So
I'm just going to, because I don't want to trip you up or anything, so I'm going to give you the second bit of the sentence. I'm just going to remind you of the second bit of sentence. They have an almost Nigerian interest in money and gadgets of all kinds.
No, I'm definitely coming to that.
Okay.
So yeah, we tend to be ambitious, and when we've immigrated to countries, etc., it's tended to be for a better life and to go and make a way for ourselves. So if I give an example, my dad came to this country in the 80s, I think, and he came with 2 weeks to stay, and he managed to naturalise eventually and just work his way up with my mum. And through social mobility, I would look at them now and say that they're upper middle class, and they've definitely helped to improve my life. I probably
so he could have said Irish or Asian or any sort of diaspora-based exodus where people have come to this country in the hope of improving their terms and conditions. Why pick on Nigeria, do you think?
Well, I think the reason why he's maybe made a reference to Nigeria is just because, being a Nigerian myself, we do have a we do have a quality which can either be looked at as good or bad, whereby Nigerians have always gone out to sort a better life for themselves and gone out to do whatever.
But all immigrants have done that. That's the bit I'm confused by.
No, which is true, and this is.
And to be fair to Boris Johnson, pre-Brexit, he did actually speak very warmly and persuasively about the benefits and the powers of immigration. Obviously, you can pick and choose which Boris Johnson you believe, but the old Boris Johnson used to talk about amnesties for illegal immigrants. But I just why Nigerians specifically? Do you think?
But sometimes when you've kind of made your Brexit analogies and you've referred to the 419 scam that some Nigerians have unfortunately been good at doing. It's maybe he's kind of referring to that aspect of. So
he's calling British young people criminals.
Well, not so much criminals, but the sentiment that would make someone want to do a scam. The way that someone would be hungry for money, maybe that's what.
Well, then that's appalling, isn't it? Because that is conflating all Nigerians with criminal Nigerians.
Well, if that's what...
I don't think he meant that. We're struggling a bit here, Valentine, to pin down precisely what he means, because he didn't talk about the diaspora. He didn't talk about aspiration/immigration. He spoke very specifically about Nigerians. And you, as a British Nigerian, having started by describing your own parents' upward drive as a result of their hard work and the opportunities that they took advantage of in this country, you've now reverted to the suggestion that perhaps actually what he meant was that He's referring to the criminals and the scammers that send those emails promising to release $100 million from my dead uncle's bank account if you just let me have your Santander details by tea time. So which is it?
It could be either one.
Yeah, I know it could, but which do you think it is?
I think he's probably referring to the latter, being the cynic that I am. But my frustration with him, whichever way he's trying to come across, is I don't understand why he has picked this habit of, writing in his columns or making comments in public, discourse. Why is he formed this habit of personifying, whatever he's trying to put across with an ethnicity or race? And that's the part that jars me. Why can't he talk about young people's Brits urge or desire for money and just use another adjective that doesn't refer to an ethnicity or race? And that's what, I almost...
Well, I can answer that for you, actually, but I could quote the disgraced former editor of the Sun newspaper to you, if you want, and it should, because I think Boris Johnson probably sups from, he's the sort of similar outlook, perhaps, but with a thesaurus. And there are some words here that I'm going to have to slightly... edit in sharing it, and I'm also going to have to point out that our attitude to the Russians from the right wing of the British media is currently changing rather rapidly, certainly in America, but also here. This is Kelvin Mackenzie quoted in the early 1980s on how he perceived the Sun's target audience. You just don't understand the readers, do you? He's the bloke you see in the pub, a right old fascist, wants to send and then a word that begins with W, routinely referred to people of colour in a pejorative way. He wants to send them back, buy his poxy council house. He's afraid of the unions, afraid of the Russians, hates the queers and the weirdos and drug dealers. He doesn't want to hear about that stuff, meaning serious news. So if you were looking for a possible answer to the question of why Johnson's points always or very often seem to include an ethnic slur, there's your reason.
Well, it's unfortunate, and
Isn't it?
I would... Looking at it, I would say he's
and
definitely...
to be fair, Kelvin Mackenzie was talking about Sun readers, not Spectator readers, but I guess perhaps that's where the thesaurus comes in.
Indeed. I mean, I would say, looking at his comments, it looks to me, if I was a betting man, that he's definitely saying something derogatory, because he's obviously trying to make the point that British children are not like, or British kids...
They're as greedy as Nigerian criminals, could be one reading of it.
Exactly.
Well, that's a thought. And you're a British. Of course, it's a shame, but here it is. I mean, it's if only it were an isolated incident, Valentine. For the record, my Nigerian uncle is a surgeon, or he was. He's retired now. So I kind of find that conflation of Nigerian with criminal, if that is what we think is happening here, quite troubling. Dean is in Wickham. Dean, what would you like to say?
I'm going to have to get Boris Johnson some duct tape for Christmas, I think.
Say that again. Duct tape. For his gob, you mean? Yes. Well, yeah. It's a bit late. It's a bit late, Dean. Talk about locking the stable door. Go on.
I know. That's it. I like listening to your show because a lot of things I'll be honest, we don't agree on.
Fair enough.
I like to get your opinion on it. But I'm just like in that position now where I don't want to vote for any of them.
No.
And I'm thinking, why don't we vote for who we want to be the leader of that party, like the public decide? Because
the problem with that, of course, it was displayed when Jeremy Corbyn got elected leader of the Labour Party by all the people who claimed, and I don't know whether it was true or not, that they'd paid their 10 quid or whatever it was to be members in order to vote for him because they didn't think he'd ever win an election. So if you're allowed to choose the leader of the party that you would tribally be opposed to, you can see the problems that would create. I think proportional representation would solve some of your problems. So you could vote for a much, much smaller party with at least a genuine hope that they'd end up in Parliament, whereas now you can only really, in most constituencies, vote for one of two choices with the vaguest chance at all of getting into Parliament. But what do you think Boris Johnson meant when he said young people are like almost Nigerian?
You know, when you saw that, what was that comedy programme years ago, and it was what is your bank code and sort of code and all the rest of it, and I was just like, oh no.
That's what you heard, is it?
What have you done?
And would I be right in thinking that normally, if you began the call by saying that you don't agree with me about everything, normally you might be quite drawn to Boris Johnson's brand of politics, but that this is...
I'm just like... I think it's what's the best of the bad bunch, really.
The lesser of the rock or the hard place, Dean. The rock or the hard place.
I mean, I'm usually a Tory voter through and through, but...
does this bother you, this comment here? I mean, because it's not new. You've got the pickaninnies, you've got the watermelon smiles, you've got the Muslim world is literally centuries behind the West, you've got the comments about ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children, which he blames single mothers for. I don't imagine the scales are falling from your eyes today, are they?
I'll be honest, I'm married to a non-EU Muslim woman.
Well, there you go, Dean.
And I'm just like, okay. I think the problem is a little bit, you know, what you were saying earlier about, being a liberal and the rest of it is, I basically judge people based on my experiences with them, which I know necessarily isn't right.
Dean, you're a liberal then? You mean you don't judge them by the colour of their skin or the colour of their scarf?
No, I don't. I judge them on basically how many, I suppose you could say it's a little bit racist, because if I...
Go on.
For example, the industry I'm in,
yes.
You work with a certain... You kind of have to deal with a certain group of people.
There's a preponderance.
And every experience you have with them is absolutely terrible. I'm naturally going to think that, not because... that would be like me meeting 3 deans who were wrong-uns and then concluding that you were a wrong-un as well. Exactly, I know it's not right, but...
It's honest of you, it's natural, it's human nature, but the trick is to fight it.
Be like that. Yeah, yes. I wouldn't say anything about it, or say anything nasty to them or anything like that, but I'd have that in my head that I'm thinking...
And yet, when someone did the same with regard to generalisations about Muslim women, you'd get the right old hump because you're married to one.
No, I'll be honest. I'm as weird as it sounds. I'm kind of the.
Go on. No, all right. I don't want you to say anything that you're going to regret later, Dean.
No, it's not.
Especially not when you get home.
No, that's the problem. And she's pregnant as well. So,
well, congratulations.
I'm walking on eggshells.
Congratulations. I've enjoyed talking to you, and most callers who start off disagreeing with me about everything, I always like to say it's just a matter of time. It's coming up. There's also a book you can get to accelerate the progress. Christmas coming up, Dean, It's coming up to 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. What do you think Boris Johnson meant? I mean, you remember I said to you, I think towards the end of last week, when did the Labour manifesto come out? Was it last week? God, it's all blurring into one. I'm with Dean on this. Seriously, a plague on all their houses. But some Conservatives were queuing up to praise the Institute of Fiscal Studies because they'd given a bit of a shoeing to the Labour manifesto. And I pointed out that they were the same Tories who dismissed the Institute of Fiscal Studies' warnings about Brexit. Up with the Institute of Fiscal Studies when it says things that are politically advantageous to us. Down with the Institute of Fiscal Studies when it points out the flaws in our own thinking. Utterly ridiculous and hypocritical. And today is Deliverance Day because they have criticised both major parties for economic plans that are undeliverable and provided a fillip to the Liberal Democrats because, of course, their call the whole thing off policy is, according to just about all available economic analysis, including this government's, the best way of safeguarding or advancing our economic interests. So I think James Cleverly was at the front of the queue of people bigging up the IFS. If you see him today, just ask him for his views on the... Actually, while you're at it, ask him about all the councillors suspended from the Conservative Party for Islamophobia and how many of them have been let back in. All right? 10:35 is the time. Speaking of matters controversial, what do you think Boris Johnson meant when he wrote that young people had an almost Nigerian interest in money? He wrote it for The Independent on Sunday, about 20 years ago. It was perhaps inevitably in The Spectator, published, of course, by a company currently chaired by the scrupulously impartial BBC politics presenter Andrew Neil. That's where he wrote about single mothers, blamed them for producing a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children. He is, of course, known to have at least one illegitimate child of his own, but rumours persist that there may be more. One very easy way, of course, to quell those rumours, which would be for him to answer the question, which he'd have to be asked. And there was some suggestion yesterday that the chairman of The Spectator, Andrew Neil, might not actually manage to secure an interview on the BBC with the ex-editor of The Spectator, Boris Johnson. Hashtag scrupulously impartial. Well done, everybody. It's also, I suppose we should also point out that on the payroll at The Spectator, of which Andrew Neil is the chair, not only have you got kind of Breitbart goons, but you've also got a woman who's married to Dominic Cummings. So if she can't have a word in his shell light, then nobody can. Watch this space. 10:36 is the time. Back to Nigerians. Regina is in Lee Green. What would you like to say, Regina?
Hi, James. I am originally from Zimbabwe.
You forgot my name then, didn't you?
No, I'm a bit nervous, so please do forgive me.
Carry on.
Okay, so first of all, I want to say I don't agree with Boris Johnson's way of politics. I don't think he is racist. He stereotyped Nigerians, and
what is the stereotype? What is the stereotype here?
They are quite aggressive when it comes to making money, and my experience both back in Zimbabwe and here is that they will put money before people. So the most extreme one, which
would you be comfortable saying that about any other ethnicity or religious grouping?
Not if that's their trait. Not if I've seen that a majority of them are like that. So
if somebody felt that Jewish people were like that, you'd be cool with someone saying that they're almost Jewish interest in money?
Well, I'll have to ask them why they say Jewish.
And they'd say the same as you. They'd say, I've met a lot of Jews and they're really interested in money, which is what you're saying to me about Nigerians.
You'll have to give me concrete examples. The thing is, I've had... hello?
I'm sorry. So you've had real-life experiences of greedy Nigerians, therefore you think all Nigerians are greedy?
Not all of them.
Well, that's what he said. He said a Nigerian... a handful. So he's referring to a handful of Nigerians, but he's just not mentioning that. He's making it look like he's referring to all of them. Because surely all societies have got a handful of greedy people in them, haven't they?
I think Nigerians, a lot of people would say that they are...
Yes?
They are aggressive, and I think their relationship with money is... Yeah, it's unhealthy.
And if somebody said that about Jews, how do you think the chief rabbi would feel?
Like, again, if it's true of a lump... I mean, you have to have examples.
So it can't be anti-Semitism because the Jews really do run the world.
No. I said you have to have... You can't just say something without backing it up.
Well, you did.
But I said I've got examples, real-life examples.
Yeah, and then we went from suddenly saying, I think he's right, to saying, well, it's only a handful.
I thought the question was, is he being racist in general?
No, the question was, what do you think he means?
Well, if he means it's all Nigerians, then I don't agree with him.
What else could it mean? And a Nigerian interest, what does that mean? It means it's a national trait.
Then he is wrong, because I don't think it's all of them. Nigeria is a very big country.
But it's just some of them, then. Knocking at the door there, Regina. I'll leave the Jewish parallel hanging. I'm not comfortable with it, but seeing as the other party leader is under attack this week from the chief rabbi for failing properly to address accusations of anti-Semitism, it seems to me a pertinent question. When he was editor of The Spectator, and he said an almost Nigerian interest in money. Explain to me how that phrase is in any way philosophically or morally different from describing an almost Jewish interest in money. Jewish people historically, of course, have had to deal with centuries of allegations of greed. Shay is in Tottenham Court Road. Shay, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'd just like to say plainly that I think he was speaking about Nigerians in a negative light, because he said avaricious previously, and that, to me, is not a positive term. It's like extremely greedy, looking for in terms of material gain.
But why pick on Nigeria? Because I am familiar with the so-called 419 scams, and I acknowledge our friend from Zimbabwe a moment ago has met a handful of greedy Nigerians, which somehow, in the foothills of her contribution, led her to conclude that Johnson was somehow justified. I'm pleased to have provided a corrective to that position. But are you of Nigerian heritage?
Yes, I am.
Right. So is this something you?
Yesterday.
Oh, did you really? That's
yes.
Right. If you got back, if you were in the taxi on your way back from the airport, I'd have given you a Ray Liotta shave. But if you got back yesterday, it's not quite good enough. So the question then becomes something I ask you in genuine good faith: is this a Nigerian stereotype that you deal with? Is this an insult that's routinely directed at people like you, that you're criminal and greedy?
Yes, given
Right.
even David Cameron's more recent statements about Nigeria being a fantastically corrupt country.
But that
And
could
I
be
think-
true. That's not a slur upon all Nigerians. That's a slur upon the ruling class.
Yes, and in this terms of what Boris Johnson was talking about, I think given the time that he said it as well, which was 99, one of our most corrupt leaders had just died the year before that,
Right.
Sani Abacha, who stole billions. So in terms of that, he probably was just thinking, again...
Yeah, but if he'd name the politician for me, name me a politician.
Sani
again.
Abacha.
Well, if he'd said that and almost a Bashan interest in money, it would at least have had
It would
the.
have been different, yes, but
Yes.
he's painting Nigerians with the same brush.
He's
which
painting
I
you with that. He's
completely
painting
disagree with.
you with that brush.
Yes, yeah, definitely. He's painting me with that brush, yeah. And I completely disagree with that, because not all Nigerians are like that. But
Well, of course
I think
they're not,
he
and-
definitely meant it in a negative light.
Can't say. Well, I suppose you could say he was being rude about young British people as well then, because if he was being rude about Nigerians and he was comparing young British people to Nigerians, he was being rude about young British people as well, and he would argue he was
Yeah.
actually praising them. He was talking about how sort of praising them. They're just as avaricious.
I don't think he was praising them at all.
No, they're just as avaricious as we flinty
Avaricious,
Thatcherite yuppies of the 1980s. In fact, they have an almost Nigerian interest in money and gadgets
Money
of
and
all
gadgets,
kinds.
and avaricious means greedy. It's money grabbing. There's no positive synonym for avaricious.
What about the gadgets?
I have no idea what that implies. Maybe he means in terms of, again, this 419 thing and internet scams. And it's just weird that this is coming up now, because we have there's so much things in the news about how they're busting up billion-pound rings.
Yes, but 20 years ago that probably wasn't true. 20 years ago that wasn't true. But if he's comparing
the timing.
if he's taking a criminal minority and using their exploits to typify an entire majority, then you're absolutely right. We've got a massive problem. Any positive interpretations of this? 10:43 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Mohammed is in Birmingham. Mohammed, what would you like to say? We may never know. Mohammed, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Sorry, I was just taking off loudspeaker.
That's all right. In your own
I
time.
just wanted to raise the...
There's only 1.2 million weekly listeners. We can all sit here and wait for you to take us off loudspeaker, Mohammed. Go on, fill your boots.
No worries. Thanks for that. No, all it was is I wanted to raise the exact same point you raised. Had you replaced the word Nigerian with...
Now, I don't normally like this. I normally think this is whataboutery, but on this occasion I'm minded to make an exception. Tell me why you think we should.
Okay, so if you get the same people who might call up and defend that comment, if you replace the word Nigerian with Jewish, and instead of Boris you said Corbyn said it, it's the exact same people will be outraged and foaming at the mouth at the comment or the statement.
I would be disgusted if Jeremy Corbyn said that, but I am also disgusted at Boris Johnson. That seems to be quite hard for people to understand, that you don't have to pick a side in these sort of issues.
I think it falls back down to tribalism, but I think it's a disgusting thing to say regardless. But again,
do you know what it means? Because it is possible there's an interpretation of it that isn't as negative as we are attracting so far. Is there a different interpretation?
I've listened to the statement. The first thing I thought of was the stereotypes that, the whole Nigerian prince and I've got money, but I need you to send me some money first. So the whole scam about it, that's kind of the stereotype. To me, it sounds like he's reaching for.
And as I say, I guess people that are offended by this kind of thing will still be offended, and people who are not, people who quite like a bit of racism, they won't be bothered by it at all. I can't wait to see your scruffy, wounded face when Boris wins a majority. Ha ha, says the kind of person that I am referring to. Oh dear, I only hold up mirrors, mate. It's not my fault what you see in it, where we contemplate the past comments of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. At the moment, we're looking at what he meant when he described young people having an almost Nigerian interest in money. We may move on to the question of why he chose to describe the children of single mothers in such unpleasant terms. Ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children who in theory will be paying for our pensions. Everyone is entitled to change their mind, although I suppose if you change it too much, it could be perceived as a sign of weakness. But here he is saying feeble and unreliable men were more to blame for the problem than uppity and irresponsible women. There's that word uppity again. Popped up a bit already this week, I think. And here is the interesting, perhaps, line from the point of view as how his own personal life has developed subsequently, is his views on marriage. The idea that we need to get back to, well, I'll quote him actually rather than Precy, we need to, quotes, restore women's desire to be married. Johnson, of course, has been married twice, but he is not married to the girlfriend that lives with him at Downing Street. He suggested it was feeble for a man to be unable or unwilling to, and I quote, take control of his woman. Gosh. But it was 20 years ago, you know? Everybody changes, don't they? 10 to 11 is the time. Tim's in Bromley. Tim, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Tim.
I just want to say that, you know, this guy has got a complete history of all the things that he says, and I'm surprised that people look at this in isolation. You've got to judge the entire man, and this is who Boris Johnson is. He's come out of these statements. I personally believe he's a Trump light. You know, he tries to dress up his words with, you know, the buffoonish kind of language of ruffled, scruffy hair and a kind of Diddums kind of attitude. But yeah, the problem is that this man, you know, is our prime. Well, he's the leader of the Conservative Party. He's been to be a prime minister, and this is the person we want to elect.
Well, hang on. What do you think he means? We need to be clear, because I know what Pickaninnies refers to. I know what Watermelon Smiles refers to. I know what he meant when he talked about letterboxes and bank robbers. I also know that a huge number of people listening to this programme are supremely untroubled by these kind of base bigotries. Indeed, you could argue, to carry on with your Trump analogy, that it actually wins him support and wins him votes. But explain to me what you think an almost Nigerian interest in money means.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I think he's trying to look at the negative stereotypes that Nigerian people are obsessed with money. This is nonsense. I've been married to a Nigerian woman for 20 years, happily married at that, and all outstanding.
Thanks for the qualification. Is she listening?
I doubt it. She's a teacher. But the fact is that this is nonsense. I mean, what did Maya Angelou say? You know, people always tell you who they are. This man is telling us who he is. And it's for the people of this country to really just see who he is. You can criticise Corbyn and all the others.
Well, yes, and we have done this week, and he obviously came under very concerted criticism from the chief rabbi, and I think responsibly, I hope responsibly, although I'm open to correction on that, if Jeremy Corbyn had been found 20 years ago to have written of an almost Jewish interest in money, I have a feeling it would today be on every single front page.
Well, you know, the press print what they want to, because at the end of the day, you know, you have to ask yourself, are they actually reporters or are they actually commentators?
Both, I suppose. I mean, some of the papers that have the most toxic and ridiculous fact-free commentary still have some of the best reporters.
Yes, but again, it's what line they have to follow. I mean, you can be a genuine reporter, you know, look at both sides of the argument and print the facts, or you can have it slanted.
Yes, or you can. I mean, it's a standard, isn't it? So this should be treated exactly the same, unless someone can give me a ring and tell me why it shouldn't. This should have received exactly the same levels of criticism and condemnation that Jeremy Corbyn would have received if he'd been found to have written about an almost Jewish interest in money, or an almost Israeli interest in money, to make it a national stereotype rather than perhaps a religious or an ethnic one.
Any culture with that. You could say a Russian love of money, or, you know, a US love of money. This is nonsense.
But I don't know what that would mean. I didn't actually know, apart from the 419 scams, which have become a kind of matter of folklore almost. They're so entrenched in our collective memory, although the scams are by no means confined to Nigeria. There was a disproportionate amount of them coming from there. That's the only thing I know about. I don't know of any, and oddly, as I've explained, like you, I have family connections with Nigeria. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't aware of anything apart from the criminality that could be taken as a trait or a characteristic common to Nigerians. Were you?
Well, you know, like I said, this man is basing it, you know, what does he know about Nigeria? Let's be honest.
Good question.
What does he know about Nigeria? To say that, a Nigerian attitude towards money. Has he lived in Nigeria? Has he worked with Nigerians?
No, but I'm aware of some I'm aware of some really greedy con men.
Look, there are greedy con men everywhere. Are you telling me we haven't got greedy con men in this country?
How dare you?
Oh, well, I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous. And and that previous lady who was talking about, well, from my perspective, my point of view, that's anecdotal evidence. You can't.
Yes, I don't know that she quite got the welcome she was expecting.
No, I don't think she did, because she was too busy trying to push out her point. The fact is...
So you've made your point. I want to squeeze in a couple more. I think we've got a broad consensus on what he meant by an almost Nigerian interest in money. Apart from Regina from Zimbabwe, most of us see it as a fairly grim thing. I think she perhaps reviewed her position slightly, but she certainly rang in to suggest that it was absolutely fine, because Nigerians are greedy and... whatever other words you want to add to this stereotype. Just ask how you'd feel if it was you. That's all you ever have to do. One of those pesky liberals. Ask how it would feel if it was you. Angela is in Milton Keynes. Angela, what do you think it means?
Hi, good morning.
Hello.
I think he's trying to tar all Nigerians with the same brush.
What brush? What brush, though?
That they're criminals. Probably that time, 20 years ago, that was when the 419 scams
yes.
and stuff were in the news. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all Nigerians are criminals or have a love for money. If he had said that we're ambitious...
Well, I suppose we have to point out that not all children of single mothers are ill-raised, ignorant and aggressive either, but that was the generalisation he reached for.
I'm a child of a single parent.
Are you? Crikey.
I'm a single mum, yes.
And you're Nigerian as well?
Nigerian.
Oh, you must be really rooting for Boris Johnson this morning, Angela.
He's got form.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, and that
why
go on.
People put him there and they want him to be the Prime Minister. I mean, it's their choice. Maybe you look at manifestos and all. But he has got form.
Yes.
The letterbox, the pickaninnies, the single mothers, and now this. I didn't even know he said that in 1999, but he has got form.
But his fans like it. This is
normalising it.
This is the point that the people miss when they, clutch their pearls and throw their arms up in horror and even perhaps begin thinking, well, this'll do for him. This'll do for him. People like it. There's no two ways about it. Some people will love it. They'll be claiming that somehow. Let me find one for you. It won't take long. Just stay there. I won't be able to find one now, will I? Here we go. James O'Brien is injecting poison into the narrative because he's so worried about the YouGov polling overnight. So this is the same bloke who has spent 3 days talking about Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism, hasn't really looked at the YouGov polling, although it looks like great news for the Conservatives. But I'm injecting poison into the narrative by reading out words that Boris Johnson wrote. They love it, his fans. They love it because he holds up a mirror, they see a racist, he makes them feel okay about it.
If it was Jeremy Corbyn that said something like this in 1999, would it be the same?
Jeremy Corbyn had said it in 1499. They'd be up in arms today. But, of course, we live in a world where the double standards have become so ridiculous that sometimes it's hard to remember what day it is. Let's talk to Rob in Bath in conclusion for this hour. Rob, what made you pick up the phone?
Greetings, James. I picked up the phone because I would put myself forward as possibly somebody similar to Boris Johnson up until about 4 or 5 years ago when I actually...
Well, you had an unspecified number of children and you went to Eton College.
No, I can't explain that kind of grandeur. But for a little old boy from the West Country, we did okay.
So you would perhaps have indulged in lazy stereotypes about Nigerians. That's what you're telling me. Fair enough. I respect your honesty.
And I think I've been privileged over the last 4 years to have all that kind of thought erased from my DNA, if you wish.
Go on.
Well, we got involved with a group of young Nigerians. We're working on plastics recovery projects across Nigeria, trying to improve the environmental structures of the place, trying to stop all the plastic going out into the Niger Delta, down into the Atlantic Ocean. And one of the most magnificent resources, the most magnificent resource that Nigeria's got, are these young men and women. Absolutely, it's an absolute pleasure to work with them. I'm catching a plane to Lagos tomorrow. We've got a big conference in Lagos on Saturday.
What a perfect call. That's absolutely beautiful. What? You don't need to answer this, but if you had to point at something that had led you towards where you used to be, as in, buying into this tabloidy racism, what would you point at? Well, how did you end up feeling that way? Because I think anybody could, for the record, just because I didn't, and I presume because I had Nigerian cousins, I could have done, I presume, if I'd been exposed to different influences.
Have you been down to Nigeria?
No, I've never been out there. I've never been there. We couldn't go when I was a kid because it was so dangerous. So
I felt that I've been to Lagos twice this year.
Yes.
I've been to Abuja, Port Harcourt, Delta State.
Gosh.
And I feel safer on the streets of Lagos than I do on the streets of London.
Blimey.
It's a tough place. Loads of. Do you know one thing about my experience of
quickly? I'm late for the news. News.
The Nigerians never have problems. They only have challenges. Mr. Rob, I've got a challenge, fella. Let's sort this challenge out.
That's lovely. No, I like it. I'll take that to the bank. Thank you, Rob. What a lovely corrective to so much of the bile that can be found swashing around these islands at the moment. Jeremy Corbyn is facing a lot of problems this morning after an old article in which he wrote about British young people having an almost Jewish interest in money was unearthed. No, I'm only joking. It's Boris Johnson, who is facing very little criticism from most of the British media after being found to have written that British young people had an almost Nigerian interest in money. Because I guess Boris Johnson doing racist stuff now is dog bites man, as opposed to man bites dog. But we're going to park that. My apologies to Jill and to Sharon and to everybody waiting to contribute to the conversation from the Nigerian perspective. I think we'll move on next to the single mother's perspective. And something for my younger listeners here is that you may find this rather hard to believe. But before immigrants, should we do it in order? How did it work? If you were to trace back the targets that the billionaire owners of newspapers encourage you to hurl your abuse and anger at in the hope that you will be too busy and too abusive and too angry to recognise who's really responsible for inequalities and exploitations in this country. Before it, what is it now? Is it immigrants in general, the EU still? So you'd probably go immigrants, working backwards. I think immigrants are still just poised as general population of people who were somehow born elsewhere, but that doesn't include everywhere, because there's places you can be born where you get filed under. No, I don't mean you when I'm being racist about immigrants, but immigrants are still probably at the front of the queue, are they, for othering? Don't blame your boss for the fact that your wages have gone down. Blame your foreign colleague. Yeah? So we'll go with that. Foreigners. Muslims, probably the last big attack on this. I know that under Jeremy Corbyn many Jewish people have felt oppressed, but I don't think anyone would claim that is a bigotry or a prejudice that's reflected routinely in almost every national newspaper. I can't think of any front pages attacking Muslims. In fact, I can't really think of any crimes committed by Jewish people where their religion would have been put front and centre in the headline in the way that a crime committed by a Muslim person would be. I could be wrong. I often am. So foreigners, Muslims, unemployed. You probably forget this, given that the gig economy has seen people reduced to poverty even when they've got a job. But the unemployed, during how many years have I been here? 15 years or so? I think Steve Allen, someone told me this morning, has just celebrated his 40th anniversary on this radio station. Absolutely astonishing. And every single programme that he presents remains absolutely sparkling. The man's a machine, an absolute marvel, a true phenomenon. But I digress. So, foreigners, stroke immigrants, yeah? Muslims. Johnson's got a form on all of this, hasn't he? Anyway, tracing it backwards. Before Muslims, I think it was the feckless Workshire layabouts with flat-screen televisions and spending all their benefits on Rothmans and Special Brew, wasn't it? I used to get so jealous because I just didn't have the bones to do this when I started being a phone-in host. I used to go down some of the routes of reactionary rabble-rousing, but as soon as I began to realise it wasn't true, I just couldn't find it inside me to crack on, which is a massive shame, because I'd probably be on Fox News if I'd been able to develop that ability to lie really persuasively about minorities, gays have always been... actually, let's go back to that line of Kelvin Mackenzie's from the early 1980s. You just don't understand the readers, do you, eh? He's the bloke you see in the pub, a right old fascist, wants to send the them back by his poxy council house. He's afraid of the unions, afraid of the Russians, hates the queers and the weirdos and drug dealers. He doesn't want to hear about that stuff. Quotes serious news. Remarkable to reflect that he was describing the Sun's target audience. Now, I suspect that could apply to pretty much every national newspaper of a right-wing bent. But the tabloidification of British society is a conversation for a different day. Before the work-shy layabouts, I think it was the single mothers. I really do. I think you're only going back 4 or 5 levels of bigotry here. And single mothers were to blame for everything. So up and down the country, women were getting pregnant just to get a council house. And everybody knew at least one person whose cousin's window cleaner's dog's original owner had done exactly that. Everyone knew at least one woman who'd got pregnant to get a council house. And from that little acorn grew a mighty oak of abuse. And of course, if you were being paid by billionaire owners seeking to reduce the protections that generally workers have in the workplace, or justify epic financial inequality, which was already growing, of course, by the time Johnson wrote these words. If you were being paid by billionaires to blame growing inequality on anyone but billionaires, then single mothers would have been a most wonderful repository for your bilious rhetoric. That's one explanation, perhaps, as to how Boris Johnson could have ended up blaming single mothers for producing a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children. Saying that social housing was an enticement for them to become pregnant. And, you know, you sort of thought these people had gone away or seen the light is the grim thing here, but actually you realise they were just shamed into silence. And then along came Donald Trump and Brexit, and suddenly shamelessness was the order of the day, as opposed to shame. As a Catholic, obviously, I'm a huge fan of shame. I think it's a very important part of our moral armoury. So, I would like to make some radio now for my younger listeners, and I would like you to ring in as a single mum or the child of a single mum and tell us about those dog days of routine abuse, when people like your mum, doing their best to raise you in often difficult and straitened circumstances, would be public enemy number one for the tabloid type approach to the British media displayed here by our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, about 20 years ago. A generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children. And I guess if you, like me, like to give your moral compass a polish every now and then, usually in private, but obviously the nature of my job means occasionally I have to get it out in public, if you pardon that expression, then how do you square his attack upon single mothers for producing a generation of illegitimate children with his own contribution to the creation of illegitimate child and or children? I just wonder, as you know, family values, 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. Here's a nice selection, and it's not in chronological order, I don't think. Immigrants, single mums, foreigners, Muslims, gay men. I forgot about the gays. I do apologise. They were absolutely top of the list. Some of the stuff that got published in The Sun back in Mackenzie's heyday was, you would not believe it now. You would not. Some of the stuff about AIDS and HIV was, I mean, truly unbelievable. But hey, political correctness. Immigrants, single mums, foreigners, Muslims, gay men, lesbians, the unemployed, benefit claimants, trade unions, football fans. Only a certain type of football fan, of course. Usually the ones that were grieving dead relatives. They were a massive target for this era of this newspaper. Greenham Common women, vegetarians and vegans. I think they're quite modern additions to the list, and I don't think yet, and I'm happy to change my view on this as and when the evidence is presented, but I don't think vegetarians and vegans feel attacked in quite the same way. I once got attacked by a vegan on this programme when I was described as a corpse-eating psychopath. I don't know that the inclusion of vegetarians and vegans on that long list of oppressed minorities is either accurate or fair, but I could be wrong. 13 minutes after 11 is the time. So that's it. I just want you to put Johnson's comments about single mothers into context. Were you of the view that they were producing a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children 20 years ago. This is one way to defend or perhaps to contextualise Boris Johnson's comments. You've got to remember that we were living in a different era, and back in 1999, I think, everyone was vile about single mothers all the time. So why are you picking on Boris Johnson? He just has the misfortune of having had his words recorded in, perhaps inevitably, or perhaps just as an indicator of where it was headed over the ensuing 20 years, The Spectator magazine. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. So give my younger listeners, if you're in a position to do so, a lesson in what it was like to be raised as the child of a single mother in the sort of 80s, 90s period when tabloid newspapers were directing undiluted bile at you at an almost daily basis. 0345 6060 973. Or do what a couple of our callers did in the last hour, which was honestly admit that actually, no, I used to subscribe to these schools of thought. And if we were to mount a spirited defence of Boris Johnson, I suppose we could say you can think of few things more illustrative of a change of heart about the undesirability of illegitimate children than actually, a few years later, going out and having one of your own. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Just a little niggle that I had following the coverage of that Blue Story film, which was pulled from cinemas up and down the country after violence at, we were told, at a cinema in Birmingham, and subsequently one of the chains involved reported that there had been 25 incidents of violence that had led to the original ban on the film. The ban has now been lifted, so I'm just trying to find out how many crime numbers were allocated to those incidents, because it's just one of those stories I haven't fully got my head around. I saw an interview last night with the director of the film, who it goes by the nickname Rap Man, and he suggested it in a way that you couldn't properly describe during the way most media treats these sort of issues, because it was nuanced and thoughtful and regretful. It was almost like Occam's razor in action on television, where he just couldn't think of any other reason why his film had been singled out for this sort of treatment, other than the fact that it's a film about young black people. It's a redemption film, actually, I'm told, with regard to gang culture. But I don't know why they banned it. And when they said there were 25 incidents, I thought, well, fair enough. And then when they unbanned it, I thought, that's a bit odd. That's all I thought. It's a bit odd. So just trying to find out how many crime numbers they can provide us with for the incidents reported. This is the current quote we've got from them. We are not providing further background. Oh, here you go. Lovely PR speak. I'm not going to name any people involved because that's not fair. It makes me chuckle because I've worked in that world for a long time, but it's not an insult against any individuals. Thanks for reaching out. Thanks for reaching out. We're not providing further background and hope you found the statement useful. Well, not really, no. I really want to know how many of the 25 incidents at View cinemas that reportedly led to the original ban on the film have been reported to police and or allocated with a crime number. That's all. 20 minutes after 11, back to single mums. Aisha is in Staines. Aisha, what would you like to say?
I completely disagree with what Boris Johnson has said. My mum was a single mother.
Well, then I'm afraid I need to ask you, are you ignorant and aggressive?
I don't believe so.
Well, I'll be the judge of that, Aisha.
My mum single-handedly raised 4 girls, and we're all working hard in our fields. One's in the NHS working, one's in the mortgage broking, and, we're all working quite hard, and we've all...
Were you conscious of any stigma growing up?
I was, yeah.
How did it come across? How did it reach you?
I found it from a cultural perspective. So in the Asian community, yes. It was, Asian mum by herself, But
what happened to your dad? Do you mind me asking?
My mum and dad just separated, and then they went separate ways. But we were just...
So there's the cultural shame attached to that from your mother's point of view within the what you describe as the Asian community.
Yeah. But my mum just taught us that you just work hard educate yourself and be something of yourself, and that's what we did. And I'm quite proud of where we are and what our mums taught us.
Well, you know, the steeper the mountain, the greater the sense of achievement at getting to the top of it. It's one of the things that confuses me most about British society and this slightly lazy stereotyping of old Etonians. Some of my best friends are old Etonians. They're not all greedy ingrates. But this idea of having achieved in life from humble beginnings, we should praise and admire that a hell of a... or difficult beginnings even. That should be what we praise and admire, not the people who've inherited everything from their dads or grown up with a silver spoon up their nose. It's quite remarkable, isn't it? It's a strange... it's a strange phenomenon.
Being Muslim.
Yes, well, oh crikey! So again, at least you're not Nigerian, because then you'd have the hat trick of Boris Johnson targets this morning. So we had a lady a moment ago who was... well, she's Nigerian and I think a single mother, and now we've got the child of a single parent who's a Muslim. We need a Muslim Nigerian single mother, and then we can send her out to Downing Street and see what she's got to say. So thank you so much. 22 minutes after 11. Tony's in Newbury. Tony, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. I was listening carefully to what you were saying.
How carefully?
Well, I was trying to listen carefully. Anyway, I'm tiling a floor at the minute. So
good man.
I was trying to listen carefully, and I was thinking back to when I was younger. We were single parent family.
Were you?
Me and my three brothers. Yeah, I think I was 6 when my parents got divorced, and back then it wasn't so much a stigma because there were many families that.
How old are you now?
I don't really like to say.
Oh, all right.
51.
All right. Why don't you like to say? Do people not know?
Well, they do.
He's got his kits on today. He's rocking 42.
I think I'm going through what you might call a midlife crisis.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I'm having a bit of fun while I'm doing it.
Well, you crack on. No problem with that at all. But I was just interested because I'm surprised to hear you say that. I know I grew up in a time where I could probably name the kids in my class whose parents were divorced, and albeit I went to Catholic schools, which obviously played a part, I could name them. Yeah. I remember when people in my mum's social circle started getting divorced, it was still remarkable.
Yeah, well, I'm from a Catholic school. Oh? I lived on an estate called Langley in Manchester, which was an enormous council estate.
Right.
There was many poor families on that, many poor families, us included. But the thing is, James, we were loved.
Yes.
And we were brought up to believe that love conquers all, and it does. No matter what anyone says, no matter how you are, because you introduce that to the next generation. But my point to you was that as I got older, and just to go back on that quickly, the love helped us cope as people when we were growing up.
Yes.
But as we got older, the next generation that came through that found themselves in that unfortunate position, I would say the stigma was absolutely thrown to them, because I don't think there was as many what you might call divorced single parent children then, and it wasn't as prevalent.
So parents had never been married. They're two different proposals, aren't they? The children of a divorced family, and then children of women who were never married to their dad.
Yeah, and they would. But the thing is that the shame on those children, and we saw it as we got older. What you could see was, well,
come on,
he's unbelievable, and there was no one there to help them.
What do you mean by unbelievable? What sort of things would happen?
Well, I've been lucky in the sense that I've got a loving wife. I've not been able to have children. We've been unable to have children, but we love children dearly.
Yes.
And back then, and I've always been like that. I've always been that way. And I've seen kids back then, even when I was growing up, when I got to 18, 19, and they were really walking around with their heads down, hands in their pockets, imitating an L.S. Lowry painting, and you can see
poignant.
But
you're feeling. Do you know what you're expressing? Yeah, you can, and of course they can.
You don't need the words; it's the actions that are telling you.
But you're expressing sympathy and empathy, you see.
Yeah.
For these people who may, as a result of their poor start in life, their sad start in life, who may end up going in directions we wouldn't want anyone to go in. But you're feeling sorry for them. He's describing them as ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive, and illegitimate.
Well, yes, he is, and I have to say that, you know, they're not the words that I would choose, put it that way. You know, I mean, I think it's...
That's the most diplomatic contribution to the programme in a long time, Tony. They're not the words that I would choose,
well,
Your Honour.
I've been watching John Ashworth and a lot, and he's been using that a lot, so
right.
I've got it straight from his mouth. But the thing is, at the end of the day, when we see kids that are suffering, and they are suffering, there is no doubt about it, they are suffering. It's not just the government, and that we all need to take note.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of right-wing politics, in my opinion, is that is the sworn enemy. That is kryptonite to right-wing politics, the idea that we should all be pulling together in the same direction as opposed to encouraging selfishness and markets or whatever it may be. And I don't know what you want to call it, compassion or socialism or Christianity or social democracy.
Well, I call it Christianity.
Yeah, I thought you might.
I'm not... you know, I'm a Catholic. I'm not a practicing Catholic, but at the end of the day,
it's in our bones, mate. It's the way we were raised.
Well, I was brought up to care. Was brought up to
love your neighbour. Love your neighbour, whether their mum and dad were still together or not, or regardless of where they hailed from or what colour their skin was, and do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. They got some stuff right, didn't they? The nuns and the monks and the priests, Tony. Not everything by any stretch.
Just a tad. But I didn't do too bad out of it.
No.
And I ended up from that broken home. All my brothers have been successful. I'm sort of like what you might call the least successful, but I've been successful, although I can say I live in Newbury, they don't.
You sound happy. You know, I hope you let me say that without me sounding... You sound like a happy man.
I'm really happy.
Do you want to know why I'm really not happy? Because you mentioned you were laying tiles this morning. So in your own home, or are you on a job?
No, I'm a tiler. I'm on a job.
All right, well then you'll appreciate this.
The most wonderful floor that you've ever seen.
Yeah, but wait, is it a bathroom?
No, it's a kitchen, diner and hallway.
Very well, here you go. This is my life this morning. It's why I'm not in such a good mood as you are at the moment. This is a text I got off Mrs. O'Brien just before the show started. Where is the stopcock? Urgent.
Right, well, let me tell you, when they come off air, get my card and I will...
you can't get round in Chiswick from Newbury in time. My house is going to be underwater. I haven't had any further texts, so we have got people in at the moment, so I presume that they found the stopcock. It was the urgent that worried me. Tony, what a lovely call. Thank you, my friend. It's coming up to 11:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Looking through, I'll put it all together. The chronology of othering, as it were, and just point out how stupid it is to fall for it. But, of course, I'll probably be wasting ink or my breath or whatever medium it is I choose to share with you just the list of how it moves. No, it's not Muslims anymore. It's Brussels, it's EU, it's Poles, it's Polish plasterers. No, it's not foreigners this week, it's single mothers. And if you want an example of how it works, although it is a slightly more complicated issue, well, a considerably more complicated issue than some of the others that we've name-checked. But if you want to have a look at the tactics that certain types of tabloid sensibilities employ when they're othering minorities or abusing the vulnerable, the best illustration in the last few years would be trans issues. Now, there are arguments there on both sides, but if you were to look at how, for example, Lucy Meadows, the late Lucy Meadows, was written about by some journalists, then you'd get a very modern flavour of how the same sort of journalists used to write about blacks or gays or foreigners of any description or immigrants. It was almost as if trans gave them just a sort of a last hurrah for base bigotry. Unfortunately, of course, since that started, all the others have made a comeback, where we are providing younger listeners with a history lesson, actually, because I imagine that for most people, learning that Boris Johnson once blamed single mothers for producing a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children will come as a major shock. Not by way of defence, but by way perhaps of context. I'm just reminding people, and indeed revealing to younger people, that routinely attacking single mothers and the children of single mothers was perfectly commonplace in this country 20 years ago. They were the precursor of immigrants getting the blame for everything, or Brussels getting the blame for everything, or unemployed people getting the blame for everything, or Muslims getting the blame for everything, or liberals or lefties, although that's a less obvious parallel. And the reason, as ever, is, of course, that if you are being paid by very, very, very rich and unscrupulous people to persuade their victims that they're not victims at all, then you need to find somebody else. You need to find a ghost train. And single mothers, and the reason why I think this is so surprising is because it's just so commonplace now. Not just single parents, but co-parenting, you know, families where mum and dad have split up, or perhaps were never actually fully permanently together, but they both take a profound and proper interest in raising their children. Other kids who are being raised by a single parent, I imagine, and actually it's 11:36, so we can add this to the list, I imagine it doesn't really happen these days, because you're not going to be, as I mentioned to an earlier caller, you're not going to be the only kid in the class who doesn't have a mum and a dad at home. You know, it's become a lot more common. It's become a lot more commonplace. But back then, it was still relatively rare. It was still incredibly easy to find a vulnerable young woman who only really experienced love in her life for the first time when she had her own baby. And our social services were constructed in such a way that the arrival of that baby meant that our country, our society, our civilization would provide it with a home. And that gave rise to claims such as these by Boris Johnson that women were getting pregnant to get a council house. And some certainly did. Maybe not quite as cynically as that for the massive majority of them, but it would be very naive to pretend that it never happened. And that, of course, would create a phenomenon or an example where the child wasn't actually wanted as much as we might hope. But the house was. These people almost certainly existed. But we're back to the Nigerian comment that we talked about in the last hour. Find me a single mother who has not been a paragon of honour and virtue, and I will show you a single mother who has not been a paragon of honour and virtue. Take a dishonest actor, take a rabble-rousing reactionary, take a bigot or a racist or a misogynist, he will find a single mother who has not been a paragon of honour and virtue, and he will make sweeping generalisations about all single mothers and all illegitimate children. And, given the nature of British politics, if a few years later he has an illegitimate child of his own by a single mother, all his fans and supporters will just look the other way, or indeed argue that it doesn't matter at all and, isn't life grand? Jackie's in Notting Hill. Jackie, what can you tell us?
Well, I get really annoyed when I hear people talking about single mothers.
It doesn't happen much anymore, does it? I mean,
no, not so much now, but certainly when I've got 3 boys,
yes.
And I found myself in a situation where I was on my own with my 3 boys. Their father decided to disappear to the other side of the world, and I was left raising them. And the one thing I didn't want to do, because I had friends actually turn around and said, I suppose you're going to become benefit scum. And they used that word.
Really?
And I was so-called friends.
Yes.
And I was really hurt. And what I did
What
the
decade was
opposite.
this, Jackie, roughly? Can you remember? Of course you can remember.
Late 80s.
Late 80s, there you go, yeah, okay.
Yeah. And what I did was I went out and I cleaned toilets, I cooked for people, I ironed shirts, I did everything around raising my children, and I wouldn't go into council housing. I went and I rented privately because I lost my own home because I was left in a situation where I couldn't pay it. And at the same time, the one thing I did, I wanted to keep my sanity. I decided that I would study, and I took 6 years and did a degree in health and social welfare, and so I could actually turn around and do something worthwhile when the children were older.
And how's that worked out for you?
It's worked out really well.
Oh, good.
It worked out very, very well. But my children, yeah, I know that they got some stick because their father wasn't around.
What sort of stick?
I'm so proud.
What sort of stick would they get? Because I'm not defending it or anything like that, but there was a, how would you put it? Kid can be teased about almost anything, from having ginger hair to wearing glasses. Anything that makes them a little bit different, they can get teased for. And we're looking at an era where being children of a single mum probably made them a little bit different. But how harrowing? I suppose what I'm saying, 2 kids get teased. It can affect one kid a lot more than it affects the other kid, even though the teasing on the table is pretty much the same.
Yes, and that's true. The sort of thing was because, I was so determined that I didn't want the boys to be seen as wayward in any way, and I pushed them into sports, and so I would be the one running up and down on the rugby touchline every Sunday, and screaming and shouting, and they wanted a dad to be doing that because it wasn't the mum's role to be doing that.
No.
And
I bet they look back with gratitude, though, don't they?
Of course. And my youngest boy actually said to me not very long ago, he phoned me and he said, we gave you such a hard time, Mum, when we were growing up. And he said, now I've got children of my own. He said, I know how hard you worked. and that, to me, was just the best thing that he could have ever said.
Also, I hope you take this in the spirit it's intended, but he probably, like me, can't. I mean, because the breakdown of a family, not as in the family breaks down, but as in how we break it down into whose roles and duties do that. When I'm on my own with my girls, Jackie, I find myself utterly marvelling at how any parent on their own, whether male or female, whether with boys, girls, or I can't believe anyone can do all that on their own. And I look back upon what the tabloids were telling me about women like you in that era, and I wonder what the hell these men were thinking, what they were on. Anybody who's ever spent a weekend on their own with their own children should have single parents on a blinking pedestal. It's an astonishing achievement to raise a child alone.
Yes, and whether it's the father or the mother.
Exactly.
I think they do and that's another thing. What used to annoy me was if you saw a single father at the school gate and he was known to be a single father, isn't he wonderful?
Yeah.
What a great man he is, sort of bringing up these
They make
children.
a rom-com about him. He'll fall in love with a nanny.
Doing the same.
He'll fall in love with the nanny, and Hugh Grant would have played him back in the day, and yet a single mother? Well, we know what they'd have been described as. They'd have been described as producing a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children.
That's it.
What a great call.
And it's why do people have to sort of have stereotypes? Because
you know why?
It's not so.
You know why? Because if we don't attack the stereotypes, then we'd start attacking the people who are responsible for inequality and exploitation and division and all of those things. It's simple. Can I ask you a personal question?
Yes.
What's the best thing about being a grandma?
The best thing is just having the grandchildren. The saddest thing is they're 3,500 miles away, and I don't get to see them often enough.
Well, I can only apologise.
Thank God for the internet.
Yes, thank God for the internet, and thank God for Skype. 11:44 is the time. Ruth is in Oldham. Ruth, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello, Ruth.
I'm a single parent. I was married. I did have 2 children. My feckless husband left and he was a professional man, I might add, left when they were 5 and 3.
Gosh.
And he never came back to see them again until they were fully grown up. So I had 24/7 responsibility for bringing up these boys on my own with very little money. I've got a headmaster son, and I've got another son now who is a talented musician, and he works for a big American company, has a very responsible job. So I get very angry about people like Boris Johnson who are saying they are ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive. Mine weren't illegitimate, but they certainly aren't ill-raised and ignorant and aggressive.
I suppose if he was here, first of all, we'd be, if he was in this studio when I'm in it, we'd be looking at the pigs flying past the studio window. I'd probably be too busy marvelling at them than actually listening to what he said. But if he was here, he would say, well, I didn't mean you. I meant the ones who got pregnant to get a council house.
well, even so, that's still not a good comment to make at all. I, at one time, was teaching young girls who were pregnant when they were in school.
Yes.
3 of them I keep in contact with. They were just unfortunate. They had sex with, their boyfriends, and 2 of them had children as a result of being abused by older men. And they have all brought their children up beautifully, with support from mothers, I have to say, very often.
Yes, grandmas, as it were.
And so I've got...
Where do you think it came from, then? Briefly, briefly, because I'm late for the break. Where do you think it came from? Because I'm a bit of a snowflake, Ruth. I've had a relatively easy life, but I can't quite... And I can understand where racism and homophobia and all that stuff comes from. Where did vileness towards single mothers come from, do you think?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether it's part of his misogynistic attitude about women anyway.
Because the whole point about women is that they're meant to just turn out children for their men folk, stay at home, cook the dinner, put the slippers in the oven before you come through. I have another friend
who's a single woman, never married, but wanted children. She adopted 2 children, brother and sister, when they were 3.5 and 2, and she brought them up on her own, and she's done an absolutely fantastic job. Those children came from a background of a mother and father that weren't looking after them properly. So to generalise the way he does is absolutely atrocious. It's out of order, and I think that he needs to stop and look at the way his behaviour has been. If he's got an illegitimate child, then he needs to start and think about the wording of everything that he says with regard to single mothers.
I suppose if he was a left-wing politician, then he'd be badgered to apologise every time he put his head above the parapet. We should look forward to seeing that happen. What a lovely call. Thank you, Ruth. I've got a really funny clip to play you. Not just Ruth, all of you. You remember yesterday when the dossier documents were unveiled by Jeremy Corbyn, showing he argued that the NHS really was on the table, the sort of minutes, if you like, of 2 and a bit years worth of negotiations between... It was set up by Theresa May and Donald Trump to negotiate a US-UK trade agreement at some point subsequent to now. And you remember Barry Gardner, the International Trade Secretary, holding up the document in a very celebratory fashion. I've said this to you before, and I appreciate it. Makes me sound a little bit aching. But I'm going to say it to you again, and I'm going to prove it to you after this break. Immigration figures that you just heard mentioned in the news bulletins. Tomorrow, I think I'll invite you to give me a call and tell me how your life has improved as a result of fewer workers coming here from other European Union countries. Nurses have gone up. Doubled, actually. Foreign nurses arriving in the UK has doubled, but the shortfall still stands at 44,000. The sooner we start training our own, the better for all concerned. 11:51 is the time. Shall we summon the Usherwood? We haven't talked about any broader political issues today. And LBC's political editor, Theo Usherwood, gets very upset if we don't find room for him on the programme on a daily basis at the moment. So I think the least we can do is summon the Usherwood. See how long it takes him to get here this time. Andrew is in Tunbridge Wells. Are you disgusted?
I am with Boris Johnson, yeah.
Go on, talk to me about single mums.
Well, me and my sister, obviously, we're a product of a single mum family. Okay. My dad left us when we were both very young, and it affected my mum hugely. Yes. She struggled to cope and ended up, relying on the state actually to keep her going. So
that's why I pay my taxes, so that you can have breakfast.
And actually, I'm hugely grateful of that. The fact that we have that social care in place to be able to do that. But we ended up in a council home, and my mum was claiming benefits, but she was also working really, really hard to keep her head above the water. We didn't live on a very nice estate and mixed with various different kinds of people who were all in similar situations to us. But the majority of those people have all worked themselves out of those situations, including my mum. But obviously, as a result of having to deal with all of that, she did suffer mental health problems, which, personally, she wouldn't like me saying this now.
No,
I'm glad I'm semi-anonymous, but
yeah, of course.
I think she still struggles with that to this day.
Well, because of the stigma, and there was shame attached, and then you'd open up your newspaper and you'd read that you were raising a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate children. It's not going to be very good.
Which is what we are, me and my sister, and actually both of us are reasonably successful in our jobs.
Good.
We've got families.
How conscious were you how conscious were you of stigma, or?
You know, when you're growing up and you're going to school, and at that time, actually, you know, single mums were pilloried a little bit,
yes.
And you know, coming from a single family, single parent family, was difficult, especially when all of your friends had families, and so it's almost like looking from the outside in as to what our family should have been.
Because I struggle, as I did with earlier callers, to work out where the negativity comes from and why the usually old white men who...
Well, it is that, though, isn't it? I think it is. It's lazy stereotype.
Oh, but it's more. I think perhaps, although this wasn't what happened to your mum, the notion of a single mother, of course, introduces the notion of female autonomy. Usually when you had a child, you're enslaved under the old model of domestic politics to your man. And the notion that women could actually pack up and leave with their children perhaps explains where some of the animosity towards single mothers came from. Andrew, I'm cracking on because I've got to blow my own trumpet, something I very rarely do. Theo Ushwood is here. Hello.
Hello.
I'm going to play you a clip. I want you to tell me who it is and when it was. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Sentence, because it is clearly not impossible to imagine somebody interviewing Donald Trump about future trade negotiations without having in front of you the summary of specific negotiating objectives that comes from the Executive Office of the President. I have had a look through it so that you don't have to. I think the most crucial line is probably the procedural fairness for pharmaceuticals and medical devices, where it states, and these are the specific negotiating objectives of the American government as detailed in this document published by the Executive Office of the President, right? There's no room here for wriggling, is there? And what does it say? Seek standards to ensure that government regulatory reimbursement regimes are transparent, provide procedural fairness, are non-discriminatory, here you go, and provide full market access for US products. And there's more. Of course there is. But as I said, it is not, sadly, impossible to imagine somebody interviewing Donald Trump about UK-US trade negotiations and not having this in front of them, because that, of course, would allow Donald Trump to say whatever he wanted to say, even if what he says is the polar opposite of what he has said previously. Go on, then.
So it was you.
Yeah.
And it was you in September?
No, it was November the 1st. I'm not that good, but I'm good. What are you here for?
I was here to talk briefly about Jeremy Corbyn and what the Labour leader is doing in terms of taking the notion of yesterday's reveal with that document of trade talks between the United States and British officials and applying...
You say reveal. For 1.2 million weekly listeners, it would have merely been a reminder.
No, I'm talking about the document was a reveal.
I know. But the content were already out there because we saw it from the American end.
Yes, of course. So, taking the document, yesterday Jeremy Corbyn was talking about the NHS, a lot of pressure on him to climb down, and now he's gone on to talking about the environment.
Instead, what he will do is plunge us into more years of painful negotiations and broken promises, whilst we are spectators watching our most precious institution, our National Health Service, get carved up and sold off before our very eyes. This election is now a fight for the survival of our NHS as a public service.
And he was talking, as I was saying, about the environment.
US officials are, and I quote, emphatic that they will, and I quote, not include mention of greenhouse gas reductions in trade agreements, close quotes, because climate change is, they say, quotes, very sensitive in the United States. Well, I don't care how sensitive it is. This is the biggest threat to our future.
The point I'm making is that talking about the NHS to start off with and then talking about the environment, but this is forming the basis of the campaign. Of course, there's a meeting this afternoon from Labour amongst the shadow cabinet to talk about perhaps more of a focus on constituencies in the north of England, but at the moment the focus is on trying to persuade people that actually if we leave the European Union and there is a trade deal with the United States, then that's going to mean not just the prospect of the NHS paying more for drugs from US companies, but it's also going to have an effect on environmental standards. And then if you're going to take it one step further, and I think this is what we're going to see in the coming days, is that we'll go back into consumer standards, maggots in orange juice, chlorinated chicken and so forth. So that's the narrative that Labour are building up, and of course the gap is closing in the polls, suggesting it's down to 7 points, which is getting towards hung parliament territory.
Talking briefly, if you could, about Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's former and possibly future advisor.
Yes. So Dominic Cummings has stood down a couple of weeks ago. That is perfectly normal.
Yes.
People resign as special advisors in order to go and campaign. What was interesting about his blog yesterday that he wrote was that he sent out a bat signal to Leave voters, is that it had the narrative of being written by somebody who is on the outside, the insurgency party, who wants to run the government for ordinary people. But he is, of course, the chief advisor, chief of staff to Boris Johnson, who is the Prime Minister of a Conservative government that has been in power for 9.5 years.
Well, we touched on this last week. They're trying to pinpoint what it is about this election that I find so puzzling.
Everybody wants to be the insurgent.
Yes, exactly. But if you've been in power for 9 years, how can you campaign as an opposition politician? I think it's working for what it's worth, but it is a bit bonkers.
But Robert Buckland, the Justice Secretary, the other day was talking about, he was on the radio and he was on other media as well, talking about whole life sentences. And the question is, but Mr. Buckland, why now? And he says, well, I've only been Justice Secretary since the summer when I was appointed by Boris Johnson.
It's amazing, isn't it?
As if the previous Justice Secretary...
Look into my eyes, look into my eyes, look into my eyes. There was no Conservative government there was no Conservative Prime Minister since 2010. There was no good. Look into my eyes, you're back in the room.
Kenneth Clarke, Chris Grayling, of course, Michael Gove have all been Justice Secretaries for the Conservatives.
Michael Gove, eh?
Yes. So that's it. I think I've taken you out to Mystery Hour.
Well, there's an honour. My mum thinks you're great.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I told her I'd tell you. I didn't say I'd do it on air. She really enjoys these bits.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
I am as well, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's all right.